I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing in the sacred plaza of Cusco, the beating heart of the Inca Empire. The year is 1510. Stone buildings tower around you. They're perfectly fitted blocks requiring no mortar, their surfaces gleaming in the Andean sun. The air is thin at 11,000 feet above sea level, and your breath forms small clouds in the morning chill. Around you, thousands of people from across the four corners of Huayna have gathered for what they believe will be a routine administrative ceremony. But today, something is different. The crowd falls silent as the procession emerges from the Coricancha, the Golden Temple. At its center, bound with rope made from llama fiber, stumbles a man whose crime was nothing more than taking bread to feed his starving children. Picture this. An empire that stretched 2,500 miles along South America's western coast, home to 12 million people, governed by laws so absolute that stealing a single ear of corn could result in death. This was Tawanchu, the Inca Empire, where justice wasn't blind, it was merciless. Most people believe the Incas were benevolent rulers who created a utopian society. They point to the empire's impressive road networks, its agricultural terraces, and its apparent lack of poverty. But here's the truth that Spanish chroniclers try to sanitize. The Inca state maintained its legendary efficiency through a system of punishment so brutal, so systematically terrorizing, that it makes medieval European justice look merciful by comparison. The man in the plaza, his name was Chuya, according to chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon, is about to become an example. His punishment won't be a quick death. The Incas have perfected something far more psychologically devastating. Public torture designed to embed fear so deeply into the population that the very thought of transgression would paralyze potential criminals. The Incas' justice was swift and terrible, wrote the Spanish priest Bernabé Cobo in 1653, describing scenes he witnessed from survivors. No crime, however small, went unpunished. No punishment, however severe, was considered excessive. The statistics are staggering. In the provincial capital, Huánuco alone, archaeological evidence suggests that between 1470 and 1532, over 3,000 people were executed for crimes that in other societies would warrant nothing more than a fine or brief imprisonment. Theft, adultery, laziness, disrespect to authority, all carried potential death sentences. The Inca legal code, known as the Inca Runa, contained 247 different methods of execution and torture, each tailored to the specific crime and the criminal's social status. The most common method was pala, death by club. But the Incas had refined this into an art form of psychological warfare. The condemned wasn't simply killed. They were displayed, tortured slowly, and their death was choreographed to send a message that would echo through generations. As Chuya kneels in the plaza, his hands trembling, the crowd understands they're about to witness something that will be seared into their memories forever. Children as young as 5 are forced to watch. This is part of their education in Inca citizenship. The empire's survival depends not just on fear, but on making that fear hereditary. The executioner raises the star-headed mace, its bronze spikes catching the sunlight, but he doesn't strike immediately. Instead, he speaks, his voice carrying across the stone plaza. Behold what happens to those who take what belongs to the Sapa Inca. What happens next will define not just one man's fate, but the psychological foundation upon which an empire of 12 million people stood. This wasn't justice as we understand it today. This was social engineering through terror, refined over centuries into a science of control that kept the largest pre-Columbian empire in the Americas functioning, without a single recorded rebellion by common people. But this was only the beginning of a story that would reveal how a civilization's greatest strength, absolute order, would ultimately become its greatest weakness. The year was 1438, and the Inca Empire was bleeding. Enemy forces from the Chanca Confederation had surrounded Cusco, and defeat seemed inevitable. In that moment of crisis, a young prince named Chuya Ocllo made a decision that would shape the next century of Andean history, but not in the way you might expect. While his father, Inca Viracocha, fled the capital in terror, Chuya Ocllo chose to stay and fight. But his true innovation wasn't military strategy. It was his understanding that an empire could only survive if its people feared their own government more than they feared foreign invaders. The prince gathered the people and spoke words that turned their blood to ice, wrote chronicler one of Betanzos, who interviewed Inca nobles in the 1550s. He told them that those who fled from battle would be flayed alive, their skin used to make drums. Those who showed cowardice would watch their entire families fed to the condors. Chuya Ocllo, who would become Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, Earthshaker, didn't just defeat the Chancas. He revolutionized the entire concept of state control. Traditional Andean societies had used reciprocal labor and community cooperation to maintain order. Pachacuti introduced something far more sinister: systematic state terror as administrative policy. The transformation began with what the Incas called Amarie, mandatory labor service. But Pachacuti's version included a crucial addition: the Watchers. For every group of 10 workers, one was designated to report infractions to imperial authorities. The punishment for failing to report a crime was identical to committing the crime itself. Picture the psychological atmosphere this created. A farmer working on an imperial road project drops his tool accidentally. In the old system, his companions would help him. Under Pachacuti's new order, they calculated whether helping him might be interpreted as slowing work progress, a crime punishable by having one's hands crushed with stone mallets. The first recorded mass execution under the new system occurred in 1440, just 2 years after Pachacuti's victory. In the newly conquered province of Huayna, 2,847 people were executed simultaneously for the crime of insufficient enthusiasm during a harvest festival honoring the Sapa Inca. The method was brutally efficient. Victims were forced to dig their own graves, then beaten to death with bronze-headed clubs called champi. The screaming continued from dawn until the sun reached its highest point. Recorded an anonymous Quechua testimony preserved by the Spanish chronicler Felipe Guaman Pomada Ayala. When silence fell, the only sound was the buzzing of flies. The smell of blood mixed with the mountain air created a scent that no one who was there ever forgot. But here's what made Pachacuti's system truly revolutionary. He didn't just execute criminals. He created a bureaucracy of fear. The Tucuyricuc, literally the one who sees all, were imperial inspectors who traveled throughout the empire with unlimited authority to investigate, judge, and execute on the spot. They answered only to the Sapa Inca himself. These inspectors carried with them portable execution kits, bronze knives for flaying, stone hammers for crushing limbs, and most terrifying of all, small cages containing live army ants that could strip flesh from bones in hours. The mere arrival of a Tucuyricuc in a village would cause entire populations to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, hoping that voluntary confession might result in a quicker death. The system's first major test came in 1445, when the province of Cajamarca attempted rebellion. The response wasn't just military, it was genocidal theater. Pachacuti personally oversaw the execution of 4,200 rebels over the course of 3 days. Each method of death was different, designed to demonstrate the empire's creativity in dispensing justice. On the first day, they used fire wrote Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, based on testimonies from Inca nobles. On the second day, they used water, drowning in specially constructed stone pools. On the third day, they used stone, crushing bones slowly, one by one, while keeping the victims alive to serve as examples. The psychological impact was immediate and lasting. For the next 87 years, until the Spanish conquest, there will be no successful rebellions by common people anywhere in the Inca Empire. Fear had become the empire's most effective administrative tool. But Pachacuti's greatest innovation was yet to come. He realized that random terror, while effective, was inefficient. What the empire needed was predictable terror. A legal system so comprehensive and merciless that potential criminals would police themselves. In 1448, he convened the Council of the Four Directions in Cusco, bringing together judges, priests, and administrators from across Tahuantinsuyo. Their task was to create a legal code that would make crime not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible to contemplate. The council worked for 6 months, creating what would become the most detailed system of capital punishment in pre-Columbian America. But the most chilling part wasn't the punishments themselves. It was how methodically they were designed to break not just individual criminals, but entire communities. Her name was Chuya Ocllo, and at 19 years old, she made a decision that would transform her into a legend of terror throughout the Inca Empire. In the highland village of Ollantaytambo in 1501, she chose to steal 3 ears of sacred corn from a storehouse belonging to the sun god. What happened to her next would be whispered about in Quechua-speaking communities for generations. But let's start with why she did it. The harvest of 1500 had failed across the Sacred Valley. Imperial storehouses remained full. The Inca administration was nothing if not efficient. But the MITA labor requirements meant that local communities had no time to tend their own fields. Chuya Ocllo's infant son was dying of starvation. The corn she stole would have fed him for 3 days. She knew the punishment, testified her sister Quispe to the Spanish chronicler Cristobal de Molina decades later. Everyone knew, but she watched her child's ribs appear beneath the skin like branches of a dying tree. What mother could choose differently? The arrest came at dawn. The Tucuyricuc inspector responsible for the Sacred Valley, a man named Huascar Roca, had been notified by one of the mandatory informants. Chuya Ocllo's own uncle, who faced execution himself if he failed to report the crime. The empire's genius lay in making every citizen complicit in its cruelty. Chuya Ocllo's execution was scheduled for the next new moon, giving time for representatives from neighboring villages to travel to Ollantaytambo. This wasn't accidental. The Inca legal system required that certain categories of punishment be witnessed by at least 200 people from different communities. The goal was to ensure that news of the execution would spread throughout the empire, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The method chosen for her execution was Ani Enikai, reciprocal suffering, food intended for the gods. She would die by being prevented from eating. But the Incas had refined starvation into a performance art of psychological warfare. Chuya Ocllo was placed in a cage constructed from hardwood beams, elevated 10 feet above the ground in the center of the village plaza. The cage was designed so she could stand or crouch, but never lie down. Every morning and evening, guards would hold food just beyond her reach while forcing her to recite the crimes that had led to her punishment. They gave her water, recorded Molina, but only enough to prevent her death from thirst. The true punishment was not the hunger, but the hope. Each day, she believed they might show mercy. Each day, the hope died again. The psychological torture extended beyond the condemned. The empire required that Chuya Ocllo's family attend the execution daily, bringing her infant son to witness his mother's slow death. If they failed to appear, they too would face punishment. The baby's crime became part of the theater of justice, a sound designed to embed the consequences of theft into the deepest levels of community consciousness. By the 15th day, Chuya Ocllo could no longer speak clearly. Her words came out as whispers, but the guards had constructed the plaza's acoustics so that even whispers carried. The gathered crowd could hear her delirious attempts to sing lullabies to her child, her voice cracking with dehydration. The most terrible thing was not her suffering, testified another witness, the village chief Amaru Tupac. The most terrible thing was how we began to hate her. She had brought this curse upon our community. Children would have nightmares. Adults would jump at shadows. We began to blame her for forcing us to witness what no human should see. This was the Empire's most sophisticated psychological weapon, turning communities against their own members. The victim became the perpetrator not just of the original crime, but the trauma inflicted upon everyone forced to witness the punishment. Chuya Ocllo died on the 19th day, but her death was only the beginning of the ritual. The Empire required that her body remain in the cage for 40 days, during which time it would decompose visibly while the community continued their daily activities around it. Children walked to school past the putrefying corpse. Merchants conducted business while the smell of decay filled the air. The psychological impact was precisely calculated. According to imperial records kept on knotted quipu strings, theft in the Sacred Valley dropped by 94% in the year following Chuya Ocllo's execution. But more importantly, the Empire had discovered something that would define its administrative strategy for the next 3 decades. Communities could be trained to police themselves through shared trauma. The system reached its peak under Huayna Capac, Pachacuti's great-grandson, who ruled from 1493 to 1525. Under his reign, the empire perfected what Spanish observers would later describe as justice without judges. Communities became so terrified of imperial punishment that they began executing their own members for crimes before imperial inspectors could discover them. A village that executed its own criminals received reduced MITA obligations, noted the chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon. A village that waited for imperial justice faced collective punishment. The choice was obvious. But the most chilling aspect of Huayna Capac's reign was how the terror became routine. Public executions were scheduled like harvest festivals, with vendors selling food and children receiving days off from work to attend. The Empire had successfully transformed mass murder into community entertainment. The peak of this system occurred during the festival of Inti Raymi in 1520, when 847 people were executed simultaneously in Cusco for various crimes ranging from theft to insufficient reverence during religious ceremonies. The execution took 3 days, with different methods used to demonstrate the Empire's administrative sophistication. But even as the system reached its terrifying peak of efficiency, cracks were beginning to appear that would ultimately destroy everything the Incas had built. By 1525, the Inca justice system had become a monster that even its creators could no longer control. The empire that had perfected terror as administrative policy was beginning to discover that absolute fear corrupts absolutely, and the corruption was starting at the very top. Huáscar Inca, who ruled the southern half of the empire after his father Huayna Capac's death, had developed what Spanish chroniclers would later describe as an addiction to execution. What had begun as calculated state terror had evolved into something far more personal and disturbing. The Sapa Inca began to create new crimes daily, wrote Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, based on testimonies from surviving Inca nobles. Looking directly at the royal litter became treason. Sneezing in the presence of imperial administrators became disrespect to the gods. Walking too quickly suggested urgency that implied criticism of imperial efficiency. The mechanics of how the system actually functioned revealed the true scope of its psychological sophistication. Every village throughout Tahuantinsuyo was required to maintain what Spanish sources called libros del mito, fear records, though these were actually knotted quipu strings that documented every punishment, every crime, and most importantly, every witness. The empire had developed a bureaucracy of trauma. Specialized officials called Huayna Capac, literally sorrow administrators, traveled throughout the empire maintaining detailed records of how each execution affected community behavior. They measured changes in productivity, compliance rates, and most disturbingly, what they call fear inheritance, how witnessing punishments affected children's behavior as they grew into adults. Children who witnessed flaying executions became 23% more productive workers, but 31% more likely to report their own family members for minor infractions, recorded one quipu analysis preserved by the chronicler Martin de Murua. Those who witnessed drowning punishment showed increased religious devotion, but decreased innovation in agricultural techniques. The empire was conducting massive psychological experiments on its own population, and the results were meticulously documented. The most effective punishments weren't necessarily the most painful, they were the most memorable. The Incas had discovered that psychological trauma could be weaponized with the same precision as bronze-headed spears. The process of a typical execution reveals the system's terrifying attention to detail. When a crime was reported, the accused wasn't simply arrested. Instead, imperial investigators would spend weeks studying the criminal's family, their community connections, their work history, and their psychological weaknesses. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was creating a spectacle tailored to inflict maximum psychological damage on the maximum number of people. Consider the case of Tupac Amaru, not the famous later rebel, but a minor administrator who embezzled coca leaves in 1523. His crime warranted death, but the manner of his death was carefully choreographed. Investigators discovered that he suffered from a pathological fear of heights, a liability in mountain communities. His execution was designed around this phobia. Tupac Amaru was forced to climb a specially constructed tower 200 feet high. Built in his home village's central plaza, the tower had platforms every 20 feet, and at each platform, he was required to confess different aspects of his crime to the crowd below. The psychological torture wasn't the eventual fall. It was a prolonged terror of anticipating it while being forced to participate in his own destruction. He climbed for 3 hours, testified a witness to the Spanish chronicler Juan de Betanzos. By the time he reached the top, his fear had infected the entire crowd. People were weeping not from sympathy, but from terror. Children were clinging to their parents. The fear had become contagious. But the system's sophistication went beyond individual executions. The Incas had developed what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic conditioning on a societal scale. Every citizen was required to participate in monthly crime acknowledgement ceremonies, where they publicly confessed minor infractions and witnessed the punishment of others. These ceremonies served multiple purposes. They normalized the act of confession, making it psychologically easier for people to report crimes. They created regular opportunities for public punishment, maintaining fear at consistent levels. And most insidiously, they made every citizen complicit in the system by forcing them to participate actively rather than simply observe passively. The empire had also perfected graduated punishment scales that were psychologically calibrated to maintain optimal fear levels. Minor crimes resulted in public humiliation designed to create social ostracism. Medium crimes resulted in physical punishment that left permanent but non-fatal injuries, ensuring the criminal became a living reminder of imperial justice. Only major crimes resulted in death, But those deaths were so elaborately choreographed that they dominated community consciousness for years. However, by the mid-1520s, the system was beginning to consume itself. The constant fear had created a population so terrorized that innovation stopped, cultural development ceased, and even basic administrative functions began to break down. People became so afraid of making mistakes that they stopped making decisions altogether. The crisis reached its peak during the civil war between Huascar and Atahualpa from 1529 to 1532. Both brothers used the imperial justice system as a weapon against each other, executing thousands of people not for crimes, but for suspected political loyalties. The system designed to create order had become a tool of chaos. The empire began to eat itself, wrote Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala. Brother accused brother, son accused father, wife accused husband. The fear that had held Tawantinsuyo together became the poison that dissolved it. But the most tragic irony was yet to come. When Francisco Pizarro and his 168 Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1532, they found an empire so paralyzed by its own terror apparatus that 12 million people couldn't organize effective resistance against fewer than 200 foreign invaders. November 16th, 1532. The plaza of Cajamarca fills with a sound that will echo through history. But it isn't the clash of weapons or the battle cries of warriors. It's the sound of 12 million people realizing that absolute obedience to authority can become a death trap when that authority changes hands in a single afternoon. Atahualpa, the Sapa Inca who had just won a brutal civil war against his brother, enters Cajamarca with 80,000 warriors. He's responding to an invitation from Francisco Pizarro, whose tiny force of 168 Spanish conquistadors has been in Peru for less than a year. What happens next would have been impossible in any other society. But the Inca Empire wasn't any other society. The Inca came in great majesty, wrote Francisco de Jerez, Pizarro's secretary who witnessed the events firsthand. His litter was covered in gold, and he was surrounded by nobles whose clothing sparkled with precious stones. But when the Spanish priest Vicente de Valverde approached with a Bible, demanding conversion to Christianity, something extraordinary happened. Atahualpa examined the book, found it meaningless, and threw it to the ground. In that moment, the Spanish had their justification for what they planned all along. But here's what made the conquest possible. A population so conditioned to absolute obedience that when their absolute ruler was captured, they became psychologically paralyzed. The battle, if it can be called that, lasted less than 2 hours. Spanish horses, steel weapons, and gunpowder created chaos among the Inca forces. But the real weapon was psychological. When Atahualpa fell from his golden litter and was taken prisoner, 80,000 warriors simply stopped fighting. The system that had trained them to never act without imperial authority couldn't function when that authority was in Spanish hands. The Indians fled like sheep, recorded Pedro Pizarro, the conquistador's cousin, not because they lacked courage, but because their very concept of resistance had been destroyed. They had been so thoroughly trained to obey that they couldn't conceive of acting independently when their chain of command was broken. The aftermath revealed the true cost of the Inca terror system. When Spanish forces demanded gold for Atahualpa's ransom, the empire's administrative apparatus functioned perfectly, but in service of foreign conquerors. Provincial administrators collected 24 tons of gold and silver, more wealth than existed in all of Europe, and delivered it without resistance because the system compelled obedience regardless of who held power at the top. But the most telling moment came when Atahualpa was executed on July 26, 1533. Despite paying the ransom, the Spanish had expected his death to trigger massive rebellion. Instead, the opposite occurred. The population, conditioned by generations of public executions, interpreted his death as proof that the Spanish possessed legitimate authority. After all, only legitimate rulers could execute Inca emperors. The natives wept, wrote chronicler Pedro Sancho, but they also began a service with the same absolute obedience they had shown their former masters. The system of fear that held their empire together now held them in subjugation to us. The Spanish quickly realized they had inherited the most efficient totalitarian apparatus in human history. They kept the Tucuyricuc inspector system, the mandatory labor MITA, and most importantly, the psychological infrastructure of terror that made 12 million people governable by a few hundred foreigners. However, Spanish chronicles also document the long-term psychological damage inflicted by centuries of systematic terror. Entire communities had developed what modern psychologists would recognize as collective trauma disorders. People experienced nightmares, persistent anxiety, and inability to make independent decisions. Children grew up expecting arbitrary punishment for actions they couldn't predict or control. The natives suffer from a sickness of the spirit, wrote the Spanish priest Domingo de Santo Tomas in 1550. They stare at shadows, confess to crimes they haven't committed, and punish their own children for imagined infractions. It is as if fear has become a disease that passes from parents to children like inheritance. The most tragic irony was that the system designed to create order had ultimately made effective resistance impossible. When Manco Inca attempted rebellion in 1536, he couldn't rally popular support because the common people were too terrified to act against established authority, even when that authority was foreign occupation. The rebellion failed not from military weakness, but from psychological paralysis. Centuries of conditioning had created a population that could only conceive of change coming from the top down, never from grassroots resistance. The very fear that had made the Inca Empire the largest pre-Columbian state in the Americas ensured that its conquest would be the most complete cultural destruction in human history. Spanish colonial administration preserved detailed records of executions well into the 1570s, and these documents reveal the final, devastating legacy of Inca justice. Even 40 years after the conquest, indigenous communities continue to execute their own members for crimes like insufficient Spanish loyalty or remembering Inca customs too fondly. The fear had become self-perpetuating. Communities that have been trained to police themselves through terror continue to do so, even when the original authority that created the system no longer existed. The psychological infrastructure of oppression had become independent of its political framework. By 1572, when the Spanish executed the last independent Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, the transformation was complete. An empire of 12 million people had become a colonial population so psychologically broken that they would remain unable to organize effective resistance for another 250 years. The Inca system of justice had achieved its ultimate goal, creating a population that was perfectly controllable. The cruel irony was that this perfect control made them perfectly vulnerable to conquest by outsiders who understood that fear, once institutionalized, becomes a weapon that can be turned against its creators. Today, when we walk through the ruins of Machu Picchu or marvel at the precision of Inca stonework, we're looking at monuments built by a civilization that perfected social control through systematic terror. The roads, temples, and agricultural terraces that tourists photograph were constructed by communities so terrified of their own government that they achieved impossible engineering feats rather than risk punishment for failure. The psychological techniques developed by the Inca Empire didn't disappear with Spanish conquest. Colonial administrators documented and preserved them, recognizing their effectiveness. These methods, collective punishment, mandatory informants, public executions designed as psychological warfare, would resurface throughout history in totalitarian regimes from Stalin's Soviet Union to Pol Pot's Cambodia. Modern Peru still bears the scars. Rural communities in the Andes continue to struggle with patterns of authoritarian submission and community self-policing that can be traced directly to Inca administrative practices. The social trauma inflicted over centuries of systematic terror created cultural wounds that persist across generations. The lesson isn't that the Incas were uniquely evil. The lesson is that any society willing to sacrifice individual dignity for collective order walks a path that ultimately destroys both. The Inca Empire achieved perfect administrative efficiency by making its people too afraid to be human. This wasn't just about justice in ancient Peru. It was about the eternal tension between security and freedom. And even today, that choice still echoes in every society that must decide how much fear it's willing to accept in exchange for order.